Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Cartography, our series of short films accompanying our Esri MOOC on cartography, where we're trying to encourage you to think a little bit more like a map maker, become a smarter map maker, and learn some of the tricks of the trade. And joining me for this episode is, well, we can't get rid of him. It's John Nelson again.
Hey, hi.
And we've got Wes Jones back to join us.
They invited me back for some reason.
Yeah, well, you did so well last time. So we're going to discuss for a few minutes lettering, typography.
Get ready to live.
Typography, lettering a map. I was always taught at university that this is referred to as the necessary evil of map making.
Necessary evil?
Yeah, and so it was explained to me as, well, you don't see text in the real world, you know, on the ground that labels places. Yeah. You know, we know places exist because of what they're called, but you very rarely actually, maybe on a street sign entering a town, but you know, there's no great big lettering.
It's an abstraction. You peel back the illusion a little bit and you see, oh, I had to label this.
So it's kind of its main function on a map is to tell people what exists at a particular place. Like, what's the difference between typeface, font? What does kerning and leading and letter spacing and all that stuff mean? Do we need to know it anymore? Let's just go through some of those terms.
Yeah.
So a typeface or a type family.
Well, the way I think of typeface, and I think typeface and font are two terms that kind of have switched over time, where the typeface is the family and the font itself is within that family. So you can have Arial, and maybe Arial Black 13 is the font. So the typeface is Arial. That's how I think of it. And often people say the font, I really like that font, but they're actually referring to the typeface.
Yeah, so the typeface is the overarching general thing, and a font is a very specific version of it. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, and within a font, we can have Roman, we can have italic. These are all different styles, right? But then style means something else altogether, so maybe let's not go down that particular avenue.
Yeah.
But you mentioned size in there, so how do we relate to size on fonts?
Point.
Yeah.
Like points.
And anymore, as far as I'm concerned, points are pixels, right? PX and point, those are the same thing to a guy like me.
That's why we've got Wes here, right?
He's going to correct me.
So, yeah, point size used to relate to a very specific dimension, okay? And but as far as modern cartography goes, you know, it's sufficient, I think, to know that, you know, general reading text on a piece of paper in a book is 10 to 12 point, and obviously larger font sizes for titles, smaller for a lot of text on a map.
And it looks a little bit crisper when you reduce the overall size of your fonts.
Yeah, and it also looks crisper and more refined. Like it just looks like a smarter map it tends to.
Because it's harder to read.
All right, let's do a quiz, shall we?
Oh, pop quiz, okay.
Smallest size font for general reading distance for, let's say, average human sight.
I wouldn't go lower than 6. But you can do 4 if you really have to.
I think 4 is the absolute minimum.
I've heard
solid
4 is the
black.
absolute minimum. When I see 4, it's absurd.
Yeah, you're right.
I'd also say it has to be black if it's 4. Like it's really got to be the most contrast.
I like to use the same color of the feature type that I'm labeling. If it's a physical feature, like an ocean, I'll use the color of the water in a darker version of that hue, and it'll be blue labels on a lighter blue ocean, or even lighter blue than the ocean color.
Problems with a map is, of course, you've got possibly multiple colors across the entire map. And how do we reconcile that with some of our type?
What I like to do, and I'm colorblind too, so color is really tricky for me at times. What I like to do, though, is like John said, try to, if it's a blue feature, I like to keep it within that blue realm. But you can also do things, play with halos a little bit. I find if you're using a lot of colors, you generally don't have to. You can, if you minimize the number of colors you use, just use whites, just use blacks, maybe a couple blues and greens. It really makes it a stronger product.
And also there's a level of, there's the dimension of transparency that you can use. You can really push something into the background and make it still legible, but not shouting at you by pushing the transparency down, or pushing the transparency up.
Yeah, so there's a lot of effects you can apply to the typographic elements. But what you don't really want is all of your text in solid black across the top of your map. Because that takes you back to this idea of hierarchy, and you're then saying that the text is the most important thing. You know, it's
like a
the
mosh
thing that
pit.
people. It's a mosh pit.
It's a mosh pit. Everybody is shouting at once. Look at me.
Maybe just trying to outdo each other with phraseology today. Okay. Here we've got, you know, a lot of black, but you know, you compare it back with size and with color, and you compare it back with transparency. And you're really trying to weave the typography into all of the different components of the map.
Now, what about serifs? Do you tend to stick with a serifed or an unserifed? Do you ever mix the two? Do you have a primary font and a secondary font?
We better define it first.
Okay.
So serifs are the small little strokes that you apply to the end of each of the glyphs in a typeface. And what I'm talking about as a glyph is a single letter. So let's take the lowercase a. A serif version would have a small sort of strokes at the end of the little foot of the A. A sans serif, which means no serifs.
Sans, without
the little strokes. So it looks blockier. A lot of people think it looks a little bit more contemporary. So over time, you have tended to see that maps have gone from a serif to a sans serif in style. Although serif typefaces are technically easier to read because those strokes help the eye actually move from one letter to the other.
Track along.
Yeah. So back to your question, I would mix, but I wouldn't mix too much. I would tend to have maybe one serif typeface alongside one non-serif or sans serif typeface, and they have different functions on the map. So maybe the serifs for physical features, and maybe the sans serifs for you know, place names or numbers or other information.
What about convention regarding things like that? So that reminds me, water features generally have an italicized font.
Or if it's a sans serif font, they would be slant.
Slanted?
Yeah.
Okay.
And why is that so? Because it
looks like it's going like this.
Yeah, it looks like it's wiggling around.
It actually makes it look like running water, you know? So the italic form of the font is trying to mimic the character of the feature that it's actually labeling. Points, lines, and areas. Let's deal with points first. So you've got a series of point features. What are your choices for labeling a point?
There's really 9 choices. Really, essentially. You got the point in the middle, and you can go around that point and decide where you want to label it, or on top of it. And you can go, you know, bottom right, top left, bottom. There's all these different positions. The ones you want to try to avoid are the ones that are right on either side of that point, because it makes it look like potentially it's part of that word.
Yeah, I always use the example of the word Oxford or London with a round circular symbol next to it, and of course then it's Oxfordo or O London, and that's why. So you don't want the symbol that it's associated with to appear as it's part of the word. But points are pretty simple. I guess the complexity is when you've got other features like linear features or aerial features, and you kind of have to move the label a little bit.
And track and curve and bend that text. I love it. So generally, as a rule of thumb, if I'm adding a label to a feature, I'll add an incredible amount of letter spacing, and then I'll double it, and it tends to look even better. So go big in that regard is my advice.
What about lines, linear features? How do we label those? What are the choices? Yeah, you again, Wayne.
Okay, well, there's several choices. You can go on top of the line, you go on the line, you can go basically below the line.
Yeah.
But you have to be careful with the line. So you're labeling a river and it really curves. You got to decide, well, where along that curve do you really want to put that label?
Yeah. The reader's looking at it like this. You can curve your head this way, or you can curve your head this way. But any more than that, it gets a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah. So we've done points, we've done lines. What about areas, the last sort of category of label features?
Basically, you can label inside the area or outside of it. I mean, there's really not much more, but there's a lot of flexibility within that. If it's a really long feature, you can stretch along that feature. Generally, my rule with big areas is just try and make it look like that label deserves to be in that feature.
Yeah. Let's say Asia. It's a pretty big area. It's a really small world.
Small word. Yeah.
So you might want a letter space to the A and the S and the I and the A. Of course, you can move the letters so far apart that they actually appear to be indistinct from a whole word. So, you know, the A is like, well, why is there an A over here? You know? It's a fine
It's hard
balance.
to push it too far, though.
So you can letter space.
Hard to push it too far.
And if you've got several words forming your label, you can you know, stack them and maybe increase the leading between separate lines of text.
What I like to do with areas is track them along the graticule to give it a nice arc that matches the rest of the map. If I've got a map where the graticules are bent in a certain way. And if my labels are perfectly horizontal, it looks like it clashes a bit. And
So
it feels more organic and
that's
like it
a
belongs.
great example of knowing enough about the sort of basic tenets of cartography that you know when you can break them as well. There is one final class of labels, that's 3D. How does that affect the way in which we might apply our general purpose labeling?
It's the same problems, it's just harder to deal with.
We've got problems of occlusion too. So as it moves off into the distance, there might be mountainous features or there might be buildings that are covering up.
So maybe you raise the label up, and instead of the label being flat to the ground, you maybe
Like a billboard.
billboard it.
Yeah.
And maybe you can apply a setting so that actually the text always remains front-facing, even though your map is rotating or something like that.
And you get a lot of cases too where you've got a label and half of it, because it's hidden, you have it half transparent, and so it maybe suggests that there's more of that feature around there. There's a lot of little things you can do.
Very quickly, marginalia, labels and type in marginalia. So we've dealt with a lot of labeling on the map, but of course text has other functions, you know, title, subtitle, legend text, source. Yeah, I was always told the most important piece of text on a map is the title, so it should be biggest. I'm not so sure anymore, really.
I do like having it set back, that it's not really standing out as the main thing that you see. The map is, but if you look at the surround, it's the main thing you see.
Yeah, the way with web maps, particularly, that actually you can hide a lot of labels behind the map in pop-ups or in switchable layers that you can turn on and off. So the big problem of, you know, you have to put a lot of text on your map almost goes away with the web map, because you can just have a checkbox to say labels on, labels off.
I really like placing it because no two cartographers are going to place those labels the same. Every map, if you did one, if I did one, if you did one, they all have the same content with those labels, but very different look to it.
Not too much. I'm trying to copy what John does.
Okay.
It's probably going to be pretty good.
Ooh, that's a good place to leave it.
And this week's map of the week, given that we've been talking about typography, is a typographic map. And there's been many of these kinds of maps over time, but I think more recently some of the best have been done by the guys at Axis Maps, and they call them typographic maps.
Typographic map is a map that's composed entirely of text. It's all type. The whole thing is type. If you've got a road, it's the name of the road repeated over and over and over again to look like a line feature. If you've got an area, it's the area name repeated over and over and over again as a fill. You get this beautiful kind of impressionistic effect as you kind of step back and look at one of Andy Woodruff's typographic maps, and you see the sense of place, and you lean in and you can see the individual names, which is kind of a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Let's pick this week on a guy called Daniel Huffman.
Daniel Huffman.
And he's cartographer in residence at the CART Lab, University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Yeah, wonderful cartographer. He's heavily associated with NACIS, which is the North American Cartographic Information Society. And in general, organizations like these, but particularly NACIS, are a wonderful opportunity to learn from the work of others, meet other cartographers who are doing interesting things, and just build this sense of community and a network that can make your work stronger and more fun.
And that's what I like about Daniel, his sort of enthusiasm and this idea that he has of wanting to engage with the community and to learn as much as to share what he knows. I mean, I learn a fascinating amount of stuff from him, from his blog, from his website, from his various interesting tweets.
His website, which is called?
Something About Maps.
Something About Maps.
Yeah, and I've never met him, but definitely the way he shares stuff is fantastic. Learn tons of things from him.
Meet these people, many of whom are, you know, more than happy to talk about, you know, their love of maps and their love of cartography. So Daniel Huffman, check out his work. Let's see what the Magic Map Box has got this week. I've got two of these, so pass these along.
Thank you.
So
is it okay if I cheat and look at what the title is?
It's not going to tell you anything. So these are ancient tools of the trade, mostly for the benefit of John Nelson, who only uses a mouse.
It's true.
So what do we think these guys are?
Okay. This looks like it's a handle of sorts. I would hold this steady.
And
Some
Wes has
settings
got
with-
a very similar one, but not quite as fancy.
Oh, and there's a sharp tip involved here.
It says Leroy on it. Leroy.
Come on, Wes.
This is a
I think
scribe.
you know a little bit about what this is, right?
Just a tiny. I've never used it. I think it's for lettering.
Yeah.
And it's
Lettering.
if you've got like an S, you kind of trace it, and it will draw a bigger S for you on the page. That's my understanding.
Yeah, so some of them have like a pantograph kind of function where you can draw larger text from tracing something. But these are just stencils where you can, very precisely create hand-drawn lettering. And it's not that long ago, Mr. Nelson, that you used to apply letters on a map by hand using these kind of devices. Leroy lettering stencils.
Give me that mouse. Let me click.
In our section on Carto fails this week, we could probably talk for hours.
Just hours.
On typographic
And we will.
issues. I've already mentioned actually earlier in the episode, some of the problems of having text too big. Okay, and that's probably one of the biggest fails you can make on a map. Is just having
Text
be
that
too
overpowers the
dominant.
content?
Yeah.
And for me too, it's that black text too. If it's just so stark and big, that's the stuff that is the hardest to take as an observer.
And a lot of that has to do with overcoming the defaults, right?
Yeah.
So if you've got an application that just is going to default to a black font, then play with another color.
Well, and talking about defaults, why is Times Roman and Arial default? Change it.
Yeah.
What about putting lines, neat lines, frames around text? Oh,
Okay, this is maybe one of my biggest pet peeves, or I might consider it a Carto fail. It's a choice that people can make. I choose not to use neat lines. If you've got a legend, you don't have to segregate it inside a rectangle. If you've got a map, you don't necessarily have to segregate that inside a rectangle. As an alternative to a neat line, what I will do for a map, though, is sometimes I'll use a vignette to help the eye track into the center of the layout.
I guess
where
all
want
of
it to
these
go.
issues of sort of too large or too much emphasis are about people trying to give emphasis and actually just overdoing it, because the word itself can be its own emphasis. So my pet peeve in that vein is underlining. Now, do you want to do
Now,
the really...
do you want to talk about this?
Well, it's the sort of elephant,
The elephant in the room.
really,
Yeah.
yeah. Comic Sans.
Never use Comic Sans? Is this true?
Well, I don't know. It's one of those things that provokes a really visceral reaction in people. I've seen presentations where someone's put a slide up with Comic Sans as the font, and there's audible groans from the crowd.
Is it like in a scientific presentation?
Yeah.
From an adult to an adult?
Well, there's a lot of likes and a lot of dislikes, and actually, as with most things, people tend to follow the herd and follow fashion. And apparently, it's great to hate Comic Sans.
Yeah,
That's right.
I don't personally have a
trashing
problem
Comic
with it if it's used in the right context. It's just there's hardly any context.
What's the
where you
context?
never use
What's the
it.
context?
All right, so the context is, maybe you're writing a children's atlas and you want a font that is readable and legible. And in fact, Comic Sans is used a lot in helping people with dyslexia because its letter forms actually promote the ability to read more clearly. So
It replicates the way that children are taught to form their letters as well.
Right,
So there are benefits to
its
it.
benefits. And with that, I might offer my guests
thank you.
today another drop of English tea and a biscuit.
That's right, this one.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me back on set, guys.
Pleasure. Thanks for joining us again.